Okay, let's talk about the second letter of John. Remember, what is our overall approach to reading and studying the Scriptures together? What's our acronym? OIA, right? Observe, interpret, and apply. Observe, interpret, apply. We want to look at the details of the text, and from there we want to move to the doctrines of the text. And then from the doctrines we want to move to worship of God, doxology, and obedience to God, discipleship. So OIA or 4Ds, whichever is easiest for you to remember. As we're looking at this letter, what are some of the things that we notice right away? And I want to encourage you to start with the title. What is the title of this letter? It's not a trick question. What's the title? 2 John or 2 John. What does that tell us right away about this letter? John wrote it, okay, so about the authorship, right. So we get the author and some context, right? So as we think about the context of 2 John, we get the author, John, and we get something about the sequence. It is number 2. And you might be asking, well, is that kind of that number 2 in the original? Well, ancient manuscripts uniformly call this the second letter of John. So even in the manuscript tradition, there is evidence that the church, as it was passing down these manuscripts, and the manuscripts themselves indicate that this was not the first letter that John wrote. Okay, so this is the second letter. So that gives us something of context. What do we mean by context? This is one of those words that we keep using. Do we actually know what the word means? What is context? Todd?
It's kind of the surrounding details
Yeah.
that you might not know.
Exactly. Right, so the word context is actually derived from a Latin. The Latin prefix con means with, so that which is with the text, with the text. So 2 John does not come to us out of nowhere, right? It comes to us in a definite context. So what are the things that come along with 2 John? We already know the author, so we have some continuity in authorship between 1 John and this letter. What else? If this is the second letter of John, go ahead, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Context of who's he writing to? He's not writing to Ephesians or Philippians. Who's he writing to?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I missed that first session, 1 John, but is it the same audience?
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Ends it with sister.
Uh-huh.
I don't think he's talking about his sister.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Yeah, thank you. We will get to that. I know it's early. What I'm trying to get at, brothers and sisters, is that 1 John itself gives us context for 2 John. So when we think about, and as we read through 2 John, we ought to be thinking about 2 John occurs in the greater context of 1 John. Now, as we remember that, lights should be going on. As we were reading through 2 John, what were some of the words that we saw? Look back over it now. What were some of the words that stuck out to you? Remember, I call this the firefly stage. What were some of the fireflies that you saw? Dan?
Antichrist.
Okay, Antichrist. Have we heard that one before? That was in 1 John, right? Antichrist. What else? Love. Okay, very good. Love. Truth, right? What else? Okay, commandment, right? So put new in parenthesis, but yes, commandment, and then this idea of the new commandment. What else? Okay, deceivers, what was that? Who else? Somebody else said? Teaching, right? Right. So deceivers. Probably we can, even at this early point, kind of link that with Antichrist, right, Gabrielle? Okay, teaching. Yep. Christ himself. Right, the word abides. We've seen that one before, haven't we? All right, so how many of these themes and how many of these ideas were present in 1 John? All of them, right? So again, it's another reinforcement that this is the same author writing in a continuous stream of thought. So that helps us. So all of you can just tap into your memory banks with verbatim data from our last 5 weeks of Sunday school, and so this will be really easy. I'm just teasing. It's hard to remember from one week to the next, isn't it? But the point is, and the reason we're kind of camping out on this for just a couple minutes is that these are recurring themes in John's writing. These themes of truth versus the deceiver or the antichrist or lies, the idea of love, and I think we can probably say this already, even though we haven't necessarily pointed it out, that love is linked with commandments, right? John does that throughout his writings, both in the gospel, in the first letter, and even here. Teaching, Christ, abiding, right? So these are all things we've seen before. Let's try to make sure we can define some of these words. Some of them we will be able to define through the text itself. But remember, the word love, we talked about that a couple weeks ago when we looked at 1 John 4. How does John define love? He gives us some help here, but also thinking back to 1 John chapter 4. How is that word defined, Dan?
Doing what God commands.
Okay, so love is linked with obedience, right? We had that. What else? Is love just kind of a happy feeling, blindly affirming anybody's chosen course of life? No. What is? Doing God's will, okay. New commandment, right? Following God's will.
Also, laying down your life.
Right. Right. So along with this, so never denying the truth, but willing to exercise self-sacrifice for the good of another. Now notice what it does say and what it doesn't say. It doesn't say self-sacrifice to just blindly affirm somebody's feelings. No, it says self-sacrifice for another's true good. Remember, this was from 1 John chapter 4, verse 10. In this was love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins, right? There's an affirmation that we actually have sinned. There are things that are wrong with us. God will not lie about that. But at the same time, God willing to die to cover those sins. So that, remember, I said willingness to die but never to lie. Kind of a biblical way of thinking about the self-sacrifice of God. But you're right, those of you who pointed this out, that for John, our love back to God, our responsive love to God's love, is intimately and inexorably linked with obedience to God's commandments. Okay, what about the word abide? What does this mean? Who remembers? Just go with the English definition.
What I remember was remain and stay, dwell.
Yeah, that's right. To remain, to stay. And now you have to kind of put on your memory cap and go all the way back to John's Gospel. But in John's Gospel, the Lord gives us a very vivid, picturesque analogy to help us understand what he means by abiding. Does anybody remember what that is? The vine and the branches, right, thank you. So this idea of vine and branches. You know what's really cool about that, just as an aside? It wasn't that the Lord Jesus was walking around thinking, oh no, I need a good analogy. Oh look, there's a vine and some branches. From all eternity past, the reason he created vines and branches is because he knew that there was going to be a day when he pointed to them and said, this is what it's like. That's how big our God is. Isn't that cool? God is really smart. Okay, so we've seen that there is some thematic overlap, a lot of thematic overlap between 1 John, 2 John, and John's Gospel. We've seen that the writer is the same, that this is the second letter in a sequence. Now let's look here at the very beginning, the very first verses. It's interesting that John does not identify himself as an apostle here. Doesn't mean he's not an apostle, but he chooses a different term to identify himself at the beginning of this letter. What term does he choose? Elder. Why do you think he does that?
He's speaking about the chosen lady.
Okay, so we're going to get to the elect lady in just a minute. I know that's a really interesting question with this letter.
Well, authority comes with that title.
Okay, so one of the questions, I'll get you too. I want to make sure I reflect for those who are listening at home or using the ears. So he chooses the term elder. And the question is, why does he choose that term? Well, it reflects authority, right? It is an office in the church. Right, Dan, what were you going to say?
Because he's speaking more to a local church context, so he's using elder because it's the local sphere. He's not talking about apostles. It's not meant to be a global letter to multiple churches. It's
Okay.
specifically to this one.
So that's one thought. The one thought is that he is, just again for those listening, one thought that Dan is sharing is that perhaps he's using the term elder simply because he is addressing a local congregation, one particular congregation, rather than the whole church. That's a possibility. Todd, do you have a thought?
I'm just guessing. When I think of elder versus apostle, I think of a little touch of humility. So he's referring to himself as elder rather than apostle.
Okay, so Todd, yeah. Well, it could be. So Todd says perhaps he's using the term elder as a mark of humility, rather than necessarily overarching, apostleship. Doug, what were you going to say?
That would be my thought, I'm not sure, but his role has changed from one of Jesus' disciples or apostles to now he's in a different role of being an elder in the church.
Yeah. So, here's the answer. We don't know for sure. John doesn't tell us why he's choosing to use this title. But this is a good opportunity for us to just pause for a moment and ask ourselves, about what time is John writing this letter? Does anybody remember from the first lesson in 1 John? Right, so late in the first century. Again, none of these actually have dates inscribed on them, but evangelical Bible-believing scholars estimate that John's letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, probably written somewhere in this range, 85 to 95 AD, okay? Now, if John is writing at this time, what is starting to happen to the other apostles? The other apostles are starting to disappear from the history, right? By this time, if this date is accurate, church tradition would tell us that two really major apostles have already been martyred. Anybody know who? Peter, and who else? Paul. Both of them, again, the Bible doesn't tell us when Peter and Paul died, but church tradition, ancient church tradition, says that both Peter and Paul probably died in the late 60s under the Emperor Nero. So the apostles are starting to pass from the world. But God, in his wisdom, God, in his mercy, set up two perpetual offices to be with the church for all time. The apostleship was a temporary office set in place by God for the foundation, laying the foundation of the church. And yet there were two perpetual offices that God, perpetual meaning they're supposed to go on to the end of the world, the end of history. And what are those two offices, those two perpetual offices? The eldership and the deacons, right. So we have elders and deacons. And in the eldership, of course, today we recognize that within the eldership there is a differentiation. There are kind of two subgroups within the eldership. What are those called? Teaching elders and ruling elders, right. So teaching elders and ruling elders. So sometimes, depending on what context you're in, you may hear a pastor referred to as a minister or as a TE, a teaching elder. Just again, depends what part of the Presbyterian pond you're swimming in that day. It really does. It really is. There's like cultural factors that go into this. Some areas of reformational Christianity are much more comfortable using RETE, ruling elder, teaching elder. Some just will say elders and pastors. But both elders and pastors fall under this office of the eldership. And so it could be, my thought, again, we don't know, but in addition to what was already said, the fact that he's addressing a local church, that maybe he's trying to show humility, and what Doug also mentioned, is it could also simply be that he is recognizing that by the time he's writing, the office of apostleship is passing. And so it's a way of reminding the church implicitly that, yes, I'm writing to you as John the apostle, but not just John the apostle. In fact, maybe you need to stop thinking so much about the apostles personally and think about and look to whom? Your elders. Is John the only one of the apostles who calls himself an elder in the New Testament? Does anybody know? If you can guess, you get a free drink from the water fountain.
Give us a clue.
Yeah, starts with P. It wasn't Paul. It was Peter, yeah. Peter, in Peter's first letter, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, he calls himself an elder as well. Again, it seems at least plausible that one possible explanation for both Peter using that title and John using the title is that they are implicitly recognizing that the foundational period of the church is beginning to pass, and we want to reinforce that the passing of the apostles does not mean the church is going to fall to pieces. God has appointed a perpetual office in the church that will help anchor the church and carry her through the succeeding ages. And that is not the office of an apostle. That is the office of the elders, ruling elders, teaching elders. Make sense? So, we don't know for sure why John uses this phrase because he doesn't tell us, but there are a number of possibilities. Okay, now look at this. He writes to the elect lady and her children. That's an interesting address. What are the interpretive possibilities here? What are the possible ways to interpret that phrase? Elect lady. Go ahead, Phyllis. Okay. So he could be writing to a church. I'm going to abbreviate the Greek for children and just say kiddos. The elect lady and her kiddos. So one possibility would be that he is writing to a church. Okay? What would be another obvious possibility? That he's writing to an individual. Maybe an individual who hosts a church in their home. Okay, how do we decide between these interpretive options? Would either one of them be, let me just ask you, how should we process these options? Context is huge. Okay, so do we get any clues from the context? Okay, verse 4. Tell me what you're seeing, Gabrielle.
That he's rejoicing that some of your children are walking in truth.
Okay, so Gabrielle is pointing out to us that one of the things John says about this elect lady and her children is that he has found some of the children walking in the truth. Is that a slam dunk silver bullet between these two options? No, but it is a piece of information, so let's hang on to that. Dan, go ahead.
Geeky question, do we know if the yous that we see are second person plural or second person singular?
Okay, so Dan asks, quote, geeky question, do we know whether these verbs and pronouns are singular or plural in the original Greek? Geeky answer, yes, but I'm not telling you the answer yet. Okay. Well, it would. But I also want to see so yes, of course, we can always go into the originals to look at the context, and I'll tell you. But not all of us have access to the originals. So before we go there, which you'd have to use a commentary for or Greek language, is there anything else we can see just from the English? Our English translations, I don't know how many of you know this, but when you think about Bible translation around the world, not every language has access to as many translations as English does. And number two, not every language that has a Bible translation has as good of translations. The tradition of English Bible translation goes back so far, almost half a millennium, to the 1500s, that over those 500 years, we have been given very excellent English translations. And so before we jump to the original, let's just see, what can we notice? Go ahead, Arlene. What are you seeing?
In verse 5, he says, dear lady, to me, and singular.
Okay, so verse 5, he says, dear lady. Okay, so that could be something that might favor an individual. Is it a slam dunk? Not a slam dunk. All right, so we're still kind of grappling here.
Referred to as a bride.
Okay. Okay, so that's important. Gabrielle just said that elsewhere in Scripture, including elsewhere in John's writing, the church is referred to as a bride. All right, so that could be a helper, a greater context of John's writing. Todd?
Yeah, that's kind of similar to what I was thinking earlier. Is there any other place where the church is referred to as a lady?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. Is there?
Sure. I mean, John also is the writer of the Revelation. And the end of Revelation talks about the marriage supper of the Lamb. Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb.
I mean specifically the word lady.
No, the word lady is actually a very rare word in the New Testament. It's not used often. Yeah, the word woman, of course, word bride, but this particular word lady, is it's a very rare word. And yeah, I have a note on that here just a little bit later. Anything else, just in the English, that could help us out here? Go ahead, Gabrielle. I'll come back to you, Todd.
I think as, a guardian of the church is what this sounds like, this whole context. He's wanting to guard what you have been taught, what you've learned. And so in verse 8, he says, watch yourselves so that we may not lose what we've worked for.
Okay.
So that's
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah, so let me repeat that for those listening. So Gabrielle is pointing us to verse 8, where John is giving a command, and he says, watch yourselves. Okay, so even in the English there, you can see that's a plural, right? Okay, so let me try to put some of these things together. So I'm going to answer Dan's geeky question with a geeky answer. Although it's not 100% singular or plural here. Sometimes John uses, sometimes the you is singular. However, some very key verbs here are translated in the plural. So the verbs that are translated in verse 6, you heard and you should walk, those are plurals. So it really, if it was translated literally and we were in South Carolina, it would be y'all heard, y'all should walk. Seriously. The Greek language makes that very clear if it's talking to a plural group of people versus a singular group of people. We no longer have that distinction in English. Older English had it. Modern English does not have it. Likewise, in verse 8, Gabrielle pointed this one out, and this one is visible in the English. Watch, that's a plural. And also, that you may not lose is plural. And that you may win. So verse 8, the verbs there are all plural. Verse 12, though I have much to write to you, that is a plural in the original. So though I have much to write to y'all. And then in verse 13, just interesting enough to point out that John also uses this the children of your elect sister greet you. So, go ahead, Todd.
I have a question. So,
Yep.
if you look at the first verse, though, so the letter is not just to the lady, it's to the lady and her children.
That's right.
So that could be your plural.
It could.
Doesn't necessarily mean plurals confirmed.
It does not. Right, exactly. So for those listening, Todd is pointing out that John is writing to the elect lady and her children. So the plurals, if it were an individual simply hosting a church in her home, that could be why the verbs are in the plural. So is there anything else here that helps decide this? You really could interpret this either way. An individual person and her children, either a church in her house or just physical family. Or it could be a church. Go ahead, Betty. Okay. Right, so that's a good point that Betty is making. That there are other New Testament letters that are written to individuals, but they're always named individuals, right? To Timothy, my true child in the faith. To Philemon, right? And here, we're not given a name. So I would say that's a point in favor of interpreting this as a church. I think there's one other thing that you can see in the English that I think tips the scales. Again, it's not 100%, but I think tips the scales toward the idea of interpreting this as being written to a church. And that's in verse 1. Paul says, the elder to the elect lady and her children whom I love in truth, and then this, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. He's saying that all who know the truth love this elect lady and her children. If he were writing simply to an individual, is it likely that all who love the truth would know and love this person?
Yes.
If it were simply an individual.
Oh, it was simple.
If it were simply an individual, I think that's unlikely. It'd be like me writing a letter to Ryan saying, to the elect brother and his children, whom I love in truth. That would be true. And all who love the truth also love you. I mean, Ryan is a lovable guy, but not every Christian knows Ryan. But if you think of the elect lady and her children as a church, it's much more likely that all the other churches currently out there, this again, the early part of church history, would know of this church and would be affirming it. So again, I'm not going to underline this in dark letters, but I am going to just, with dashed lines, say that it's probably more likely, and most evangelical interpreters would say that he is writing to a church. Now, why does he use the word elect lady? We're not told, other than the fact that the church is referred to as a bride. But you guys know the phrase assonance? What does the word assonance mean? It means things sound similar, right? So the Greek word here for lady, kuria, sounds a little bit like the word for church, ecclesia. Curia, ecclesia. I mean, again, they have some similar sounds, so maybe that's what's going on. I'm not sure. And who knows? I mean, it could be that he's writing to a church or to a group of churches that is under the threat of persecution and that he's writing a little more cryptically. That's also a possibility. Was there persecution in the church by the mid-'80s? There was. It wasn't as bad as it got later in the 3rd and 4th centuries, 2nd and 3rd centuries. But there was sporadic regional persecution even at that time. Ryan, go ahead.
So, Pastor, when was John put on the island of Patmos, and could he have been going through maybe some trials at that point, and sentenced to go there?
Mm-hmm. I believe, again, my memory on that particular point is a little foggy, but I believe that John was exiled to Patmos toward the latter end of this period, sometime 90 to 95, because by the time he's writing the book of Revelation, which is dated pretty close to 95, 96, he was on the island of Patmos. Go ahead.
Ken Gentry gives a very good reason that Revelation was written before 70 and he was on that.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard there are people that think Revelation was written pre-AD 70. I don't believe that's true. I disagree with that interpretation. But it's out there, sure.
So my point...
What's your point, Ryan? Yeah, go ahead.
Bringing that up, Pastor, is just the veiled language. He's needing to talk with these folks. The fact that he says, I have so much more to tell you, but I can't do it with paper and pen, because it could be...
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, there are times if you ever had the opportunity to be communicating with Christians who live in a context where persecution is a real threat, you do have to write in veiled language. When we lived overseas and we were communicating via electronic media that could potentially be monitored, we would use a cryptogrammatic language. You can use different letters, you can misspell, you can reverse spellings, you can use euphemistic words. Of course, since we're on the internet, we will not talk about exactly how that works. But the point is, what we see here could be something like that, where he is intentionally veiling his language. So, if we're going to assume that he is, at least for the sake of today, we're going to assume that he's speaking to a church, what is he trying to say to that church? What is the point he is trying to make? Think about some of those themes. Think about the ideas that we're seeing. What do you think John's main point or main points are? What is he saying to us? Do you have a thought, Dan? Go ahead.
Careful who you invite in your home.
Okay, so one thing that he points out to us is what verse?
It was starting verse 8, roughly.
Okay, watch yourself. Let's look back at that. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward.
And then after that, I think 9, 10.
Yep, I'm going to keep reading. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. Okay, So that's one of the things he's trying to say. So what is he doing there? He is warning against what?
False teachers.
He's warning against false teachers, right? And he's warning pretty strongly. He says, if they do not, all the way back to verse 7, if they do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh, such a one is what? The deceiver and the antichrist. How serious is that? Very serious, right?
It tells them that whoever is greeting is taking part in their wicked works in verse 11.
Right, yeah, that's right. And Gabrielle is pointing out to us that he also adds, after saying, do not receive them into your house, even if you give them a greeting, you are taking part in their wicked works. Okay, yes, Diane, go ahead. Uh-huh. Yep. Uh-huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a great question. So verse 10 seems to say, if anybody comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. That is what the words say. What does that mean, and how do we apply that today? Okay, so context. To whom is John, or of whom is John warning against? Is he warning against pagans? People that just have no faith in Christ, no connection to the church historically? No, he's not. He's not warning against the first century equivalent of Hindus over in India, or animists down in Africa, or in north, the nature worshiping Vikings up in northern Europe that the church hadn't met yet. Specifically, whom is he warning against? Christian heretics, right? Not really Christians anymore, but heresies that derived from Christianity. So that's an important piece. So would this warning apply to Muslims or Hindus? In my judgment, it would not. Now, people might disagree, but in my judgment, those are separate enough that there's no danger of confusing them for Christians. So welcoming them into my house is not giving them a platform to teach their Christ-denying theology. However, there are other groups that we would say are Christian cults. What are some of those? Okay, the Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah, Mormons, Latter-day Saints. Yeah, exactly, same groups. Those groups would claim to be Christians. They would claim to be carrying on the true teaching of the New Testament. Brett, go ahead.
In Titus, it talks about how people have crept into the church and unnoticed.
Yep. Right. So, go ahead, Todd. Do you have a thought?
Is it safe to also interpret this as being, don't let them into your house? It's essentially, you're not bringing them in as brothers. Like, it's not just the coming into your house. It's kind of saying, like, we are the same. So, I mean, again, I'm taking
Yeah.
a leap that I'm doing an interpretation, but
No, I don't think you're taking a leap. So for those listening, Todd is saying, when John warns them not to bring them into their home, I think what you're saying, Todd, I'm just going to paraphrase, is that we need to ask the question, what does it mean to welcome somebody into your home in a first century context? So I want to.
specifically even in this, because of that heresy of Gnosticism, specifically here, I think because John is warning them, look, if you could fall for this. It's like if you say, somebody says, I'm a Christian, but they deny Jesus Christ, then you could fall into their same boat. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking he's saying, don't welcome them as brothers, or,
Okay, so the question is, is it illegal to welcome them at all, to let them through the doorway, or is it more about giving them the recognition of brothers? That's what you're.
Yeah, and specifically like today, I think if a Mormon came, there might be times when I'm like, come on in, and then but the goal might be, sure, you can tell me about your faith, but what I really want to do is tell you about mine. And what am I?
Okay, I want to go to Rosemary first, and then I'll come back to you, Dan, then I'll go to Aaron. Go ahead, Rosemary.
I would think that the largest cult of the planet would be the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so the Roman Catholic Church definitely has some variations, some serious deviations from the biblical truth. There are things that they teach that we would say are, according to Scripture, heresy. Our denomination, the OPC, has never gone so far as to label them a cult. They are a very large presence on this planet. Let me go to Dan, and then I'm going to go to Aaron. Go ahead, Dan.
If we assume that this is the church, maybe not a person's home, but a church, could we imply that that's bringing in a teacher to teach in the church setting and welcoming them as a brother? I'm thinking through like 1 Corinthians 5, where it says, the unrepentant man, treat them as an unbeliever if they're unrepentant type of thing, showing differentiation or...
Yeah. Aaron, what were you going to say? It's possible, Aaron. Dan, to answer your question, that's a possible interpretation. Aaron, what were you going to say?
One thing that I think will help put this in a more contemporary context is a number of years ago, a lot of evangelicals signed on to some ecumenical agreement, kind of aligning themselves with the Catholic Church. It was kind of ironic that that was brought up, and there were a lot of Reformed thinkers that did not think that this was a biblical union to engage in for various reasons, like you said, that they're teaching to agree with. And then I think also going on with what Dan said too, even if the person isn't physically present, if we, if a church, takes a certain pastor's teaching and says, hey, we're going to have this class for Sunday school for the next, few months, that's equally as bad. This is false teaching that's being brought in. And so in a sense, back then it would have just been because the philosopher walked up to the door and you want to give him a platform. Now it can be that, but it can also just be, we're adopting this new curriculum, and it turns out it's kind of heretical.
Okay, so for those listening, what Aaron was saying is it could be not just, especially today in our multimedia age, it could be that we need to think in terms of not just physically welcoming somebody into our home or into our church, but actually bringing in the teaching through books, media, other resources. Go ahead, Harry.
Just go back to is it a person or is it a church? This section really does argue on behalf of it being a church, not an individual. I don't think this is something that prohibits believers from, when a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon knocks on your door to bring them in and discuss the truth of Scripture with them. I don't think it prohibits that. I think it prohibits having that person come in to a church and teach.
Okay, so that's a possibility. Just what Harry was saying, he doesn't read this as saying that you could not welcome a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness into your home to speak with them, but rather it's really referring to not giving them a platform in the church. Let me pause the conversation here and just ask, how many of you have ever had a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon into your home to discuss these things, or have met them on the porch? Those of you who have you found them to be particularly teachable and open to hearing from you? No, when they come in, you have? Okay, so there's occasionally. In general, when they come into your home, what is their agenda? Say that again? They want to change your mind, and they're not I've had conversations with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. I've not found them to be particularly teachable or particularly interested to hear what I had to say. So there are different options on this. Some would say this is a prohibition against welcoming them into your personal home. Some would say it's a prohibition against welcoming them into the church. It's definitely a prohibition against welcoming them into the church. If a Mormon evangelist or a Jehovah's Witness wanted to come and teach Sunday school, your elders would automatically say no, and if we didn't, you should drag us out back. I'm just going to stop there. You should remove us. I'm going to go to Doug first. Doug, you had something to say?
I think a good modern day application could also be who we endorse on our Facebook. Like if you put somebody that you don't know what their teaching is, you could, accidentally be endorsing someone who maybe is a modalist.
Okay, so being very careful as to what you put your stamp of approval on, whether as a church or an individual. Go ahead. Uh-huh.
And to reject their neighbor is totally contrary to what he's written in 2 books here. So I think taking up Aaron's idea, it's more of an ideology. We should loathe wicked ideology. We should hate. Yes, we should hate
Okay, so yeah. Okay, so yeah, let me paraphrase for those listening at home. And so the comment was that it's really more about rejecting the ideology rather than the person. Am I paraphrasing you correctly? So it sounds like I might be actually in the minority here, guys. But I have always interpreted this that I do not welcome cultists into my home. I'll speak with them on the porch. I can put up some chairs. We can sit down. Some of them won't drink coffee. I'd offer them coffee or tea. But I will not have them into my home because I don't want to expose my family to false teaching. I don't want to welcome them under my roof. And I know that 21st century is different from the first century. In the first century, welcoming somebody into your home, you were not just offering them shelter from the sun. It was like you're putting them under your protection. You're going to support them while they're with you. It was a much stronger. But I still feel personally that actually having somebody into my home, sitting in my living room, I've had Muslims in my home. I've had people of other faiths. But if it's specifically a Christ-distorting, gospel-distorting cult, we will speak on the porch or we will speak on the doorstep. That's how I personally interpret this. Again, you don't have to follow my lead. I'm just telling you that is also an option, and that is how I've seen it. Diane, go ahead.
Even if you don't have somebody proselytizing to your door, if you had a family member or a neighbor who invited over to dinner or something like that, and you kind of like, hey, they're Mormon, or you know they're Mormon and they're Jehovah's Witness,
Yeah.
wouldn't you still want them to come to get to know them so you can just
Sure.
pray for them? And obviously
Yeah.
they're going to have that conversation, well, I believe this, but counter it, so
Yeah.
I don't, you know what I mean?
So Diane's asking, well, what if it were just my neighbor and I found out they were Mormons? Oh, that's different for me because they're not coming on the doorstep with the tract saying, hey, can we teach you about our faith? If they're just my neighbors and I get to know my neighbors, they come in, oh, yeah, I'm a Jehovah's Witness. Okay. Can I tell you about it? No. I know all about it already. We're here to get to know one another as neighbors. You're not welcome to teach that to my family with my family listening. Yeah, again, it sounds like I'm in the minority. I'm comfortable with that. I hope that you are as well. Go ahead, Betty.
I just admire the strong position of not wanting false teaching to your children. I'm just thinking in the media, we are inviting the media all the time into our homes, and we've got to be on the alert all the time. Those messages that you can be whatever you want to be, and all the other false doctrines and teachings that go on.
And in my experience, I have found that both Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses are willing to talk on the doorstep. They don't feel like they have to come in. So then it's just me. I'm out there speaking with them. If they wanted to go to a coffee, again, some of them won't drink coffee. They wanted to go to a tea house or something, that would be fine. But to actually bring them in and like have my kids gathered around, my family, I won't do it. Doug, go ahead.
I don't think that there's that many door-to-door Catholics trying to achieve the same thing as Mormons. How would you deal with that?
So I know that there's been some conversation here today pointing out that the Roman Catholic Church has seriously deviated from gospel truth, and that's true. However, the particular heresies that John is getting at here, these are things that go very deep. People denying the incarnation of Christ. The Roman Catholic Church does not deny the incarnation of Christ. And the Roman Catholic Church is a complicated beast, is it not? One of the places I lived before, the Roman Catholic Church sponsored this massive billboard right in the corner of town that just said, "Trust Jesus." That's a pretty good message. I can get down with that. I didn't like the picture that they had with it, but let me go to Chuck and then I'll come to you, Mike. Go ahead, Chuck.
Coming from the Methodist Arminian viewpoint, there's a lot of teachers that I used to listen to, and they would say, I was a big Andy Stanley fan. I love the guy, I love the way he talked, the way he presented. Everything was great. Then they said, well, Christians need to divorce themselves from the Old Testament. It's just the New Testament you should read.
The warning flags are going off, and it's like, womp, 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 right.
Said some stuff that I didn't particularly agree with. And so I just put it in my mind, I don't think that God is a Methodist. I don't think he's Catholic. I don't think he's Muslim. I think he's God. And so I'm not going to judge they say, I love Jesus, you know, Jesus is, it's all about Jesus, it's all about God, so I kind of give people some slack, even though I don't agree with what they're saying, so.
Right. So for those listening, Chuck was trying to remind us that the core of what it means to be saved and to be in fellowship with God is to have a faith in Jesus Christ, and that can exist even in contexts where there's a lot of other problematic elements going on. Mike, you wanted to make a comment.
The considerations, there's conservative and there's liberal, and like I think of the Nazarene, some of the Nazarene churches are having women pastors, but there's people leaving and going to a Nazarene church where there's a man in the pulpit and not a woman. So I think about Titus regarding to what John
Okay.
writing here.
Yeah. So what Mike is saying is, what about just poison that is kind of already infected even Protestant churches? So let's play with that for just a minute. And we're almost out of time, but this might help clarify the question about what would I do if a Roman Catholic came as well. Suppose suppose somebody came to you from the mainline church. Mainline, it doesn't even matter, mainline Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, whatever. In those communions, there is active toleration for those who deny the resurrection of Christ, those who deny the substitutionary atonement. And they came to your doorstep and said, hey, I'm from the mainline church XYZ. I would really like the opportunity to persuade you to come into your home and tell you all about why you shouldn't believe in the resurrection or penal substitution. Would you welcome them into your home? I wouldn't. I would say, you want to talk to me, let's talk on the doorstep as long as I get to speak too. You want to go to a coffee shop and talk, fine, but you're not coming in and exposing my family to this nonsense. That's not loving toward you or toward my family. And so earlier someone asked, what would I do if a Roman Catholic came? If they just came as my neighbor and wanted to speak about gardening or about, common concerns about the way society is going, we have a conversation. But if they say, hey, would you let me in your house to try to convince you to become a devoted Marianist? I would say, no, I'm not going to let you in my house to sit down with my family and speak about these things. Go ahead, Diane. Sure.
One would be if you engaged a family member or neighbor and the conversation did come up and they were trying to put in your faith, but you're also sharing with your faith, are you going to sin because you're allowing them to listen, to say, this is what I believe, and you're having an open conversation and you're trying to proselytize, and perhaps you don't have your children around, but it would be just you, are you going to sin because of that one? And because I would think any unbeliever, I would give them a moment to explain. And two would be, for my own, like I'm trying to understand, Roman Catholics, are there legitimate born-again Christians? Like, if you were a Roman Catholic, but I'm not saying blanket. Are there legitimate born-again Christians in the Roman Catholic Church, would you say?
So the second question first, do I believe there are born-again Christians in the Roman Catholic Church? I say the answer is yes. Personally, I do believe that's possible. I think it's in spite of the church's official teaching, but the church's official teaching is inconsistent. And so because it's inconsistent, I think it is possible for people to live in that inconsistency. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's safe. I would never counsel a born-again Christian to remain in the Roman Catholic Church, but I believe it is possible. And the second question was, let me just make sure I understand. So if somebody was just in my home, an unbelieving person was in my home, or maybe a member of a cult was in my home for some other reason, and the conversation came up, would I engage it, or would that be sinful? I don't think it would necessarily be sinful, but I think the sin here is giving them a platform to intentionally promote their faith within my home. Again, that's my interpretation of this passage. I think it goes beyond just the public sphere. I might be wrong, but that's, we each have to live according to our own conscience on this. I would not intentionally give them platform space under my roof to promote heretical teaching. If they really were pushing it, I would just say, look, Bob, not this Bob, not any of the Bobs here. When I was an engineer and I had to come up with like a variable name for computer, I was always just B.O.B. And so Bob's my default name. I would just say, Bob, I don't want to have this conversation here. I'm uncomfortable this going further. Can we do this some other time, just you and me, outside of my home? That's probably how I would tackle it. Well, we're out of time, brothers and sisters. I hope that however you come down on this particular question, which is an important question to think through and pray through, I hope that you will get the big picture from 2 John, which is that we need to be consistent in our spiritual life, loving God, following the truth, and that we need to be discerning as to how we interact with those who are trying to subvert the truth. I think that's the big message of 2 John. And the other details, some of which we can legitimately disagree on. All right, I'm going to pray, and then we'll adjourn for now. Our God, we do thank you for preserving this letter as part of the New Testament canon. We thank you for the faithfulness of the apostle, even in his later years, to continue to write to the church and to show pastoral care for these churches that were new and young and fledgling and exposed to so many dangers. What a reminder it is to us, our God, of your care and your love for the church. Help us to take that away as another lesson from this morning, that you love the church, that you care for us, and that you do, by your Spirit and by your word, empower us. And through faithful shepherds, elders, pastors, deacons, helpers, you enable us to walk in the truth. And so please help us, Lord, and help us to be discerning and consistent and watchful. In Jesus' name, amen.